Next up, I'd like to introduce Snyder. Window is the former Chief Software Security Officer at Intel. Intel is ranked number 46 on the 2018 Fortune 500 list with $70.8 billion of revenue in 2018. Window also most recently served as a Chief Security Officer at Fastly, Apple, and Mozilla Corporation. And interviewing Window will be Peter Rubin, a senior correspondent at Wired. He writes about the intersection of culture and technology, specifically AR and VR, and the future of human interaction. His book, Future Presence, How Virtual Reality is Changing Human Connection, Intimacy, and the Limits of Ordinary Life, was published in 2018. Please give it up for Window and Peter.
Across in front of you. Hi, everyone. Add a little more context to the introduction of Ms. Snyder here, who I could not be more excited to talk to. For 2 decades, Snyder has been at the forefront of corporate security, helping some of the world's biggest companies safeguard their own data as well as that of their customers. Former Chief Software Security Officer at Intel, Chief Security Officer at content distribution company Fastly, 5 years at Apple working on security and privacy strategy, as well as some memorable features for OS X and iOS. Her earlier roles include my favorite title of all time, Chief Security Something or Other at Mozilla, where she was responsible for security engineering, communication, and strategy, as well as being a founding member at Montesano, a security services and product company based in New York City that was acquired in 2012. As a senior security strategist at Microsoft in the Security Engineering and Communications organization, she managed the relationships between security consulting companies and Microsoft's product teams and the outreach strategy for security vendors and security researchers. Previously, she was also responsible for security sign-off for Windows XP SP2 and Windows Server 2003. Are we done? No, we are not. There's more. Ms. Snyder was also Director of Security Architecture at Stake. She developed application security analysis methodologies and led the Application Security Center of Excellence. And before moving explicitly into security, she was a software engineer for 5 years, focused primarily on security applications. And of course, she is the co-author of a book, Threat Modeling, a manual for security architecture analysis in software. Wow. A lot to get into. You've clearly had all manner of titles, not just Chief Security Something or Other, but many of them involve the word chief or director. But if you had to draw a through line through your career, what sort of arc specifically would you say unites all of these positions?
I'd say trying to work on security problems that are both difficult, not well solved, and have a significant impact. So when I went to Microsoft, they were really struggling with malware, lots of malware. And they had this legacy code base, Windows, that was enormous. And trying to get to a place where you could get in front of malware was the challenge there. So the impact is enormous. Any change you make in security would immediately impact hundreds of millions of people using Windows. And it was hard because it's such a large code base. It does so many different things. It's an operating system, right? So how do you get your arms around mitigation strategies that can address the kinds of challenges they were up against, the kinds of threats that the entire platform would have to address, while simultaneously balancing all the different things that people need to do with a general purpose operating system. Taking on different challenges. One of the reasons I went to Apple was because I thought that if somebody was willing, if there was a place that was willing to do the work to make security more accessible, easier, available to consumers who don't want to spend their time thinking about whether or not this website has an expired certificate, should I accept that? Like, you want to get something done, you want to get to that content, nobody wants to do the work to do this analysis. Even security experts are willing to take shortcuts with security when it means it's in the way of something they're trying to get done. So if somebody was going to be willing to make the kinds of choices that would allow consumers to not have to think about security, but still have a secure device, a secure experience, then I thought that place might be Apple. So that's one of the reasons that I went to work there. And then once I got down that path, I realized that there was nobody working on privacy, which was something that I felt really personally invested in. So getting to work on privacy features and security features for both those platforms was incredibly exciting to me, but also because it felt like something that would be able to demonstrate to the rest of the industry that you can do this kind of work for consumer devices, for consumer consumption, and create a better experience, and it would be valuable to the people who use it.
Given that that's at the absolute core of Apple's messaging these days, it's all about privacy, and as such is on the lips of every company, everyone from Microsoft to Google to Facebook at their developer conferences this year, privacy, 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 yet when you got to Apple, that was a transition that had yet to be made. Talk to me a little bit more about the timing there and how much that was coming in from inside the company, how much you kind of made this your own mandate.
It was definitely difficult to convince executives at Apple that the privacy features we were coming up with, that we were trying to get into the operating systems, would be appreciated by consumers, when at the time the data that we had showed that consumers didn't care about privacy. And I believe that it wasn't that they didn't care about privacy, it's that they felt like they didn't actually have an option. Like, if Facebook has a monopoly on all your friends and they do something that makes you feel uncomfortable when it comes to privacy, are you going to leave your social community behind? If this is the way that everyone's interacting. For example, in my kids' school, this is how the parents communicate. So if I wasn't willing to be on Facebook, I wouldn't be able to be part of this community socially. That's, for most folks, not a choice that a trade-off they're willing to make. So either they felt like they couldn't do something about it, or they felt like every other option would be similar, or they didn't understand what the impact would be of having the data on their devices leveraged by analytics networks, by advertising networks, by potentially the carriers or the network providers. What would that actually mean to them specifically? But making a case that the cost of a privacy feature, which for Apple is pretty significant because you're putting something up in front of the user, hey, do you want to give this access to your contacts, to your photos, to your location? It's a speed bump into the app, which is not how they wanted to do things, right? You wanted a seamless experience. You want things to just work, and that's not ideal. So making that trade-off to put the consumer in charge of their privacy came at the expense of that seamless feeling of being able to download something and get it to go instantly without having to do a whole lot of work. But I think over time, as we had small successes, we started to see that consumers appreciated it, that the world was starting to wake up to the cost of these privacy trade-offs, and consumers were more excited and more willing to accept that road bump because they appreciated being asked.
Working at companies at kind of the grandest scale and companies that were just starting out, obviously the bigger the company means the more money to devote to solving a problem, but it also means the bigger you are, the harder it is to change direction and steer the ship. Which do you think has kind of held true more consistently in your work with larger companies? That it's tougher to redirect, or that it's easier to solve problems?
For a lot of these problems or environments, we know what we need to do, and the willingness to do it is generally the harder part, because it's not enough for, let's say, an executive to decide, we are going to do this, the Bill Gates memo, now we are going to do, we're going to take security seriously, we're going to change what we're doing. That happened before I got there by a few months, but it was months of beating my head against a wall before we could start to see the business move. And the reason that they moved was not the Bill Gates memo, it was the customer pain from Blaster and Slammer and this onslaught of worms and viruses, where it was an environment of people getting more and more frustrated with the security situation. That's what made the impact, because there was also an aspect back then of like, what do we do? Because this was the kind of problem that was not, there were not a whole lot of examples of taking a code base that had so much vulnerability and trying to get it to a place where it was resilient enough to face the most significant security threats. That's a pretty significant change, and it took more than a decade for Microsoft to get to a place where they were resilient against modern threats.
You were also, I'm glad you bring up Microsoft, because you were involved in an internal movement there that I think kind of speaks to this as well. As a creator of Blue Hat Hacker Conference, tell the audience kind of a little bit about what that was and what the net effect of it was, because there was almost an ulterior motive here.
A little bit. So for having been part of the security research community, I would go to these conferences and engage with folks, and I would get to hear the work that they were doing and how it would impact the technologies that we were building. But only a handful of folks from even a big company like Microsoft would be able to attend these sorts of things. So part of it was bringing those really relevant talks into the engineering team so that they can actually see what their customers were up against. But part of it was also bringing the executives to this audience, to this content as well, and making sure that they could see that the attackers were sophisticated, that our technology, our mitigations were insufficient to even these threats, and make it something they could understand and feel viscerally, that like these folks have found a way to compromise your technology, and it's great that they're essentially on our side because they're telling us about it. There's a whole set of folks out there that would like to leverage those vulnerabilities for their own purposes, and we've got a lot of work to do. And I feel like actually, no matter which company I'm in or which technology I'm looking at, it always feels like we've got a lot of work to do. But trying to find that balance between what threats are we trying to mitigate and what is an appropriate investment to address that, and which sorts of threats might make sense for the business to tolerate. That's one of those trade-offs that's really hard for folks to understand, because from a security perspective, it's great to say, we'll do everything we can, we'll lock it down as tightly as we can, and very often that would result in an unusable system, or a system that is in conflict with the business needs. We can't ship these features that our customers need, or the performance is so slow that it's unusable, or buried under 6 feet of concrete with no input device is not super functional, so that's not going to serve our needs. Very secure, but doesn't matter at that point. And it's very hard, I think, for a lot of security folks to say, this is an imperfect solution, or at least I can conceive of a solution that's better, but this is the right choice for the business because this enables the things that the businesses care about while mitigating the threats that, let's say, meet our bar. And there's some set of things that you just have to tolerate, because the attacker, given an infinite set of resources and an unlimited amount of time, they will eventually find an opportunity, and they will be successful if that's the investment that they're willing to make. And there are places where that's the case. So since you can't be perfect, and you can't make an infinite investment in securing a system, a network, an organization, what is appropriate, and trying to find that balance where you've made an investment that's appropriate to the business, appropriate to the threats you're up against, appropriate to how your customers or your partners will value that investment, and then saying, we will tolerate this set of threats, and that's appropriate for our business model.
It's an interesting, not hedge, but working in security, absolute success doesn't really exist, right? Absolute success is completely invisible in the sense that nothing bad happens. So how do you set expectations? Like you said, is that just a measure of the vulnerability or disaster we're able to tolerate?
Even when nothing bad happens, you don't know that something bad didn't happen. You just know that you didn't see it, which is a really different thing, right? Because if you don't put any investment into your ability to identify what's happening in your network, in your infrastructure, in your systems, then it's really easy to never identify any problem. You don't identify an attacker, and so you must be secure. So that's a problematic way to measure whether or not you're successful. Defense is never successful. Like at best, we have come up with a plan, we executed against our plan. It is sufficient to the threats that we are concerned with, but there are threats that we don't know about, and there are threats that we do know about that are unmitigated, but that is above our bar, and the significant investment in making ourselves secure to that threat is inappropriate to the, let's say, the impact of the worst case of that threat being exercised. So it's, if you start from the position of we're never going to win, it's easier to deal with this. So yeah,
Great to think about the future that way.
Success is much easier to understand when you're on offense, right? You get into the system, you capture that flag, you get the keys or the data or the asset that you're after. You're in the system, and for defense, it's about being consistent. It's about management and execution, and let's say reducing your window of risk by getting things deployed faster, or by reducing your attack surface, or by further compartmentalizing your data or your processes, your areas of function within an application or a large deployment. If you do that, you can say, I did the things that I needed to execute against this plan. But that's not the same thing as saying, I am secure now. You can say, it is sufficient to our needs, and we have executed against the plan that we've already evaluated to be sufficient to our needs. But you're not ever going to be able to say, and now we're secure.
So many high school basketball coaches just had their worlds torn asunder by the idea that defense is not the best offense. So let's bring this a little more towards the audience, in the sense that we have a lot of founders here, we have a lot of startups in the audience. There are not a lot of Windows Snyders in the world. Does every startup need a U? What advice would you give founders?
So when you have a really small organization of any sort, building software, building hardware, building an app that's hosted in the cloud, you probably can't justify an entire headcount for security engineering. I mean, unless there's a critical component of your system that requires it. But it's a difficult justification for a lot of small companies or early stage startups to make. But you don't have to wait on doing security engineering until you have a resource that's got the right expertise or the experience to go do that work. You can actually get quite far with the team that you have. And this is kind of my regret about the book Threat Modeling, which came out in 2003 or something like that. And I think it's like 270 pages or something like that. If I were going to write the second edition of that book today, it would probably be a pamphlet, because I feel like the threat modeling has grown to this process that feels onerous, that feels too heavyweight for smaller companies or smaller development teams to actually get started with. But you can actually do a lot of work in a really short period of time without doing all the heavyweight stuff that, like someone else wrote a book on threat modeling, took my work at Microsoft, and he was at Microsoft too, Adam Shostak, and he wrote another book, and that book is 600 pages. And it's a really expensive process. And I want to go the other direction and say, hey, you can spend a couple of hours, think about what your security requirements are for your system, your application, your process. And this is true even if you're creating like a mobile game. Like there's still security requirements for that project. And then evaluating whether or not your mitigations for your requirements are appropriate. And then walking back things like, are we leveraging the security mechanisms available to us through the platform? That could be from the application server, that could be from the operating system, that could be from the language. There are a lot of security mechanisms that are built into the platforms that you're leveraging for other purposes. It might be where we're leveraging storage through iCloud, or we're using authentication through, Facebook or Google. There are a lot of things that you're leveraging from all these other platforms. you should think about security in the same way, that don't write your own crypto routines. You've got crypto routines available to you from the application server, from the platform, from the OS. You've got secure communication available to you. You've got authentication mechanisms available to you. You shouldn't have to rewrite any of these, but then go further to see what other mechanisms are there that you could leverage in your application. It might be a way to store secrets securely. You might be able to store it in a secure enclave. You might be able to store information securely through an existing API that's already built for you. So evaluating whether or not you are taking advantage of those mechanisms, because those are built by a pretty significant team of security engineers. Those are built by folks and reviewed by folks who do have that significant skill set, that are able to evaluate the implementation level details for security strength. And when they're evaluated by the rest of the world, they're interesting enough to get the attention of security experts, because a vulnerability in one of those places impacts everybody. So they get a lot of inspection, and that is as close as we get to confidence, right? So it's not secure, but it's probably secure enough for your purposes. And when there is a problem in it, it's not going to be, you'll be collateral damage along with everybody else, but it won't be a problem in your system. It'll be a problem in this core system that impacts everybody. And so for a lot of these small organizations, that is sufficient to the threats you're trying to mitigate. And a good trade-off, especially if you only have a handful of developers and you want to minimize the amount of time that you spend on the kinds of features that your customers or your users probably won't feel and see, and they just expect you to have in place. They won't see it if it's not there until it fails, but they will expect you to be taking care of their personal data. They will expect you to be taking care of their credentials and their financial transaction and all these aspects of different parts of your system, application, game, app, whatever.
Speaking of which, starting in a desktop application world to a web world to a mobile world, and now we are in the kind of early stages of this entirely new age of computing between machine learning and computer vision and immersive technologies like AR and VR. There are sensors, and everything is pointed everywhere as a security and privacy advocate. What worries you the most about this, about the advent of these? What do you most want to get out in front of, or most want to urge people to get out in front of?
I do feel really uncomfortable about the number of places that are no longer private. And they weren't necessarily private before. Like walking down the street, you don't necessarily expect that people can't see what you're doing. You're on the street, or hear your conversation if they walk by you. But you don't necessarily expect every door to have a security camera that's both recording that you walk down the street, but also potentially your conversation, your, what you're doing, maybe even leveraging facial recognition to assess whether or not you're one of the people who live in that building, or whether you're just somebody delivering a package. It's getting to be more and more concerning that we don't have an expectation of privacy when we're minding our own business at a coffee shop, because somebody might be using a camera that's constantly looking for what's happening, or a device that's listening for you to ask for their attention, but it might be recording what's happening in the environment to pick up cues to better figure out how to advertise to that user's, the device owner's attention. All of this makes me very uncomfortable, but I also see an emerging trend, which makes me very happy, to reduce the amount of data that you're storing, that it's an asset potentially, but it's also a liability. And if you're not using it, if you don't have a business purpose for keeping that data, then reduce your risk by eliminating it. Make the data that you do capture less granular. Instead of saying, this happened at Tuesday at 3:22 p.m. and 42 seconds, you could possibly just say this happened on Tuesday. That might be enough for the analysis that you're doing with that data. That's very specific to your application, but I'm seeing more and more places where people are talking about this, how to engineer for privacy, and that makes me feel better, because at the same time, we're also developing more and more ways to capture data, more and more ways to record and analyze what's happening around us. And I would prefer since it's hard to opt out of that because I don't even necessarily see the person walking down the street who's got a device on them that's recording this information. It's nice to think that maybe the people who are engineering it are assessing whether or not the data they've collected is required for their business needs and then disposing of it so they don't have to secure it.
That's the best guideline I can think of for companies starting out in this space. Well, please join me in thanking Window Snyder for her time today, everybody.
Thank you both for such a powerful conversation. I would like to invite the Startup World Cup founder, Anis Uzman, up to the stage to give gifts of appreciation to both Window and Peter.
What's that? Yeah, this is sick.
Thank you very much.
No, absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Oh, wow. Thank you.
Thank you very much.